Hello everyone and welcome to this audio podcast today. This audio podcast is part of the Cytometry Cyclone. This audio podcast is part of the Rakas and Bombard episode, and this audio podcast as part of a Storm Robotics production. In this audio podcast today, in and through this audio podcast today, looking at human renal transplantation, human kidney transplantation, and healthcare practices, sort of following on from uh, from um, uh, from the theme of this audio podcast in a previous audio podcast as part of this series, looking at aspects around the immunobiological sort of concepts. So in in regard to human renal transplantation or human kidney transplantation and healthcare practices, then so apart from co-stimulation and human transplantation, there have been works postulating in an integral role of immune regulation for transplant tolerance identified across investigations. Investigators have informed, for example, that tolerance in rodent laboratory investigations can often be adoptively transferred by lymphocyte from long term survivors into naive secondary test recipients. Secondly, the maintenance of immunological tolerance requires persistence of donor antigen, and thirdly, cellular infiltrates containing a large proportion of T cells can be frequently found in tolerant allografts. In some such cases, recipients have immunosuppression therapy withdrawn. Um, Early investigations on phenotypic characteristics of regulatory T cells in peripheral transplant tolerance indicate that both CD8 positive and CD8 28 negative T cells are restricted to allergenic HLA class 1 antigens, but able to prevent upregulation of B7 molecules by T helper cells on antigen presenting cells or APCs. In investigations through swine through swine renal transplantation investigations, host immune regulatory mechanistics are contributed, at least in part, to peripheral tolerance induced by a short sort of modulation of older immunosuppression such as cyclosporine A pharmacotherapy. Indeed, at the same time, lymphocytes, and possibly CD8 positive cells from tolerant recipients were able to suppress anti-donor cytotoxic T lymphocyte responses of naive recipient matched lymphocytes. At the same time, although the goal of transplantation is to sort of achieve a long-term acceptance of the allograft, little is actually understood about the mechanistics responsible for successful tolerance, at least in context of entirety. Several concepts have been forwarded to help explain the immunological tolerance to the immunobiological or immunological tolerance to transplant to and in around the transplantation in around transplantation. One investigation investigation with clonal deletion with clonal deletion of the donor specific lymphocytes in long-term transplant survivors uh, One investigation had dealt with donor specific the deletion of donor specific lymphocytes in long-term transplanted survivors, and this meant that rejection mediating donor specific alloreactive T cells have selectively been eliminated in such patients or recipients. Another possibility is that donor-specific T lymphocytes have become anergic or non-reactive, so that they cannot function anymore as effector cells mediating allograft rejection. A third concept is long-term prognoses or long-term prognoses where survivors have developed suppressor lymphocytes or soluble suppressor factors which downregulate the donor-specific immune effector responses against the allograft. Important to this is also the idiotypic network concept, whereby the immune response triggers antibodies and T cells as regulatory mechanisms or mechanisms of the immune response. Another hypothesis has been to explain long-term allograft acceptance persistence in the recipient of donor derived dendritic cells that promote an immunological mediated chimeric state between the recipient and the transplanted organ. Regardless of the mechanistics of transplant tolerance, it must be noted that most long-term transplant patients or recipients require continuous immunosuppressive treatment for maintaining allograft function. Although some notable exceptions have been evidenced and documented in amongst more recent literature. That draws this audio podcast to a close. This audio podcast is part of the Cytometry Cyclone. This audio podcast is part of the Rakas and Bombard episode, and this audio podcast as part of a Storm Logistics production.